You are 530 feet beneath the surface of Lake Superior. It is black down here. The water never climbs above 4 degrees, cold enough to stop a heart in minutes. Your lights swing through the silt, and something appears. A wall of steel taller than a house. It is the hull of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and half buried in the mud beside it lies a man who has been waiting in that darkness since the 10th of November, 1975. Here's what I found after years of chasing this wreck, and what almost nobody says out loud. The largest ship ever lost on the Great Lakes did not sink the way the official report claims. The crew was not swallowed in an instant with no warning. At least one man aboard saw the end coming, and there is physical proof lying on the lake floor right now. That single detail, a body, a life jacket, and a photograph taken in 1994, is what pulled me into this case and never let me climb back out. Because there is a dive log from a manned submersible called Delta, and a set of images so disturbing that an entire country later passed a law to make sure no one could ever take them again. Stay with me, and I will show you exactly what those divers saw. This is not a campfire legend. Every piece of it is on the record. I want to be honest with you about how this started, because I was not looking for a mystery. I was sitting in a rented cabin on the Michigan shore one wet November night, and an old song came through a tinny radio speaker, Gordon Lightfoot, singing about a ship I had never heard of. I remember the rain hitting the window in sheets while he sang the line about the wives and the sons and the daughters, and I remember thinking, that is not a made-up story. That is a real ship and real men. By morning, I had a stack of printouts on the kitchen table. I did not sleep. I have not really stopped reading about it since. Let me give you the ship first, because the size of it matters to everything that comes later. The Edmund Fitzgerald was launched on the 7th of June, 1958. She was 729 feet long, which at that moment made her the largest vessel on all 5 Great Lakes. People called her the pride of the American side. They called her the Big Fitz. She carried iron ore pellets, thousands of tons at a time, from Superior down toward the steel mills. For 17 years, she made that run without serious trouble. She was not a cursed ship. She was a workhorse, and everybody who watched her pass thought she was unsinkable, in the way people always think the biggest thing they have ever seen is unsinkable. On that final trip, she was loaded with 26,000 tons of taconite ore. Her captain was Ernest McSorley, a man with more than 40 years on the water, and a reputation for pushing through weather that made younger captains stay in port. He was 63 years old and reportedly planning to retire. She left Superior, Wisconsin on the afternoon of the 9th of November with a crew of 29 men. Not one of them would ever be seen alive again. But here is the first thing that stopped me cold when I started reading the timeline. The storm they sailed into was forecast, and McSorley knew it. Weather services had been tracking a system building over the plains. By the night of the 9th, it had exploded into one of the worst November gales the lake had produced in a generation. Winds were clocked at over 50 knots, gusting far higher. Waves were running 25 to 30 feet. And still, 2 ships were out there in it together. The Fitzgerald and a second freighter called the Arthur M. Anderson, whose captain would become the last human being to speak with McSorley. That radio relationship is where the official story begins to wobble for me. Throughout the afternoon of the 10th, the 2 ships stayed in contact. The Anderson was trailing behind, keeping the Fitzgerald on radar. And around 3:30 in the afternoon, McSorley radioed something that no captain wants to say. He reported that the ship had taken on a list. He said he had a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and that he was taking water. He asked the Anderson to stay close and help him navigate because his own radars had failed. Think about what that means. Hours before the end, the Fitzgerald was already wounded. She was leaning. She was letting water in somewhere. And the man in command knew it and said it out loud over the radio. This is not a ship that vanished in a single unlucky second. This was a slow, grinding emergency that the crew was living through in real time, in the dark, in 30-foot seas. That detail alone did not match the picture I had in my head, and it would not match the story I was about to be told by the official investigation. Then came the last words. At around 7:10 in the evening, the Anderson called the Fitzgerald to check on her and to warn about another ship in the area. McSorley's first mate answered the radio. The Anderson asked how they were making out with their problems. And the reply came back, calm, almost gentle, "We are holding our own." That was it. That is the last sentence anyone on Earth ever heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald. Minutes later, the Anderson looked at her radar, and there was nothing there. No mayday. No flare. No lifeboats. 729 feet of steel and 29 men had simply dropped off the face of the water. I read those 4 words, "We are holding our own," probably 100 times before they truly landed on me. Because a man who says we are holding our own is not a man who thinks he is about to die in the next 5 minutes. He thinks he is managing it. He thinks he is going to make it to shelter behind Whitefish Point. Something happened in the space between that sentence and the blank radar screen that was faster and more violent than anything the crew was prepared for. And figuring out what that something was has consumed marine engineers for almost 50 years. The first people to actually look at the wreck were not divers at all, they were machines. In the spring of 1976, the United States Navy sent down an unmanned submersible called Curve 3, the same type of robot that had recovered a lost hydrogen bomb off the coast of Spain years earlier. It descended into that black water and sent back the first images of what remained, and what it found did not clear anything up. It made everything worse. The Fitzgerald was in 2 pieces. The bow section, the front of the ship, was sitting upright on the lake bed, driven so hard into the mud that the ship almost looked like it was still trying to sail. But the stern, the back third, was lying upside down about 170 feet away. And between them was a chaos of torn steel and spilled ore, a debris field where the middle of the ship should have been. The vessel had not simply sunk, she had been ripped apart. And that is the exact question that has never been answered to anyone's satisfaction. Did the Edmund Fitzgerald break apart on the surface, torn in 2 by the monstrous waves so that both halves plunged down separately? Or did she go down whole and intact, nose first, and only shatter when her bow slammed into the lake bottom 530 feet below while her stern was still up near the surface? Because a ship that long, if she dives straight down, could have her front end buried in mud while her back end is still in open water. The stress would tear her in half like a breadstick. The wreck tells you she broke. It refuses to tell you where. The official answer arrived in 1978, and I will be honest with you, when I first read it, I wanted to believe it. The National Transportation Safety Board released its report, and it settled on a cause that sounded reasonable and tidy. They blamed the hatch covers. The Fitzgerald carried her ore in a long cargo hold sealed by 21 huge steel hatch covers, each held down by dozens of clamps that the crew tightened by hand. The board concluded that those clamps had not been properly fastened, that the enormous waves washing over the deck had forced the covers open, and that water had poured into the cargo hold all afternoon until the ship lost her buoyancy and dove. It is a clean story. Human error, loose clamps, slow flooding, case closed. And for a while I told myself that was probably it, because it is the kind of dull, sad answer that real life usually hands you. The world is not full of monsters. It is full of small mistakes that add up in bad weather. I genuinely tried to accept it and move on. But the more I read, the more that explanation started to fall apart in my hands, and I was not the only one who noticed. The Lake Carriers Association, the organization that represented the shipping companies and the men who actually sailed these boats, formally rejected the hatch cover theory. These were not conspiracy theorists. These were professional sailors who had spent their whole lives on freighters exactly like the Fitzgerald. And they said flatly that the hatch clamp explanation was wrong, that in the real world crews rarely tightened every single clamp on every hatch, and that ships had sailed for decades that way without sinking. If loose clamps sank ships, they argued, the bottom of the lakes would be carpeted with wrecks. If you have made it this far, I need you to stay with me for the next part, because this is the section that finally broke my own doubt and made it impossible for me to go back to the comfortable version. I really did want the boring answer. I wanted loose clamps. Let me walk you through the exact evidence that took it away from me, the same way it was taken from me, piece by piece. The Lake Carriers Association had a rival theory, and it pointed at a place on the map called the 6-fathom shoal near Caribou Island. A shoal is a shallow underwater ridge. 6 fathoms is 36 feet. A fully loaded freighter drawing close to 30 feet of water, passing over a poorly charted shoal in 30-foot waves, could scrape her bottom hard on rock she never saw coming. And remember what McSorley actually radioed that afternoon. A fence rail down, vents damaged, a list, taking on water. Those are exactly the symptoms you would expect from a hull that had been torn open along the bottom hours earlier, quietly filling from below where no hatch cover could ever explain it. Later surveys even suggested the charts of that area were off, that the shoal extended farther than the maps showed. McSorley may have passed over ground he had every reason to believe was safe. Maybe you feel it too, sitting there right now, staring at that photograph in your mind, sensing that the tidy report you were handed just does not hold water. That gap between the official story and the evidence lying in the silt is exactly what I spent years living inside, and it is the whole reason I put together the Lost Origins Complete Library. It is 3 digital volumes you can read tonight on any device you own, no special app needed. First Threshold shows you where the map runs out and the real evidence begins. Deep Signal hands you the grammar of evidence, how to read contested findings without being fooled, the same skill that let me see through the hatch cover story. And Hidden Systems pulls every framework into one complete casebook, including the Durupinar Archaeology of Sacred Claims. Here is something you can do for free tonight. Before you buy a single thing, take the Göbekli Tepe problem I mentioned in the first volume, search it yourself, and check whether that site really is thousands of years older than the textbooks admit. The data is public, and you will see the gap with your own eyes. The fastest way to get the books is to scan the QR code right there on your screen, or go to the link in the description or the pinned comment. Do that, and the next time an official report tells you the case is closed, you will know how to read the silt for yourself. Now let me tell you what happened when the researcher in me collided with the human one. So now I had 2 official-sounding explanations that flatly contradicted each other. The government said water came in from the top, through the hatches. The sailors said water came in from the bottom, through a hull scraped open on a shoal. And both sides had credentials and both sides had reasons, and neither side could prove it, because the one thing that could settle the argument was 530 feet down in freezing black water where no human being had ever gone, until someone finally did. And this is where my search stopped being about engineering reports and became about something much harder to shake. Because in the 1980s and 90s, people started going down to the wreck in person. In 1980, the famous ocean explorer Jacques Cousteau sent divers from his ship Calypso down to the Fitzgerald. They were among the first human beings to actually touch her. And when they came back up, the Cousteau team leaned toward a conclusion that neither official theory wanted to hear. They suspected the ship had broken apart on the surface, in the storm, before she ever went under. In other words, she did not gently fill and dive. She was torn open in the waves and came apart while men were still aboard and awake. But the descent that changed everything for me came in the summer of 1994. A man named Frederick Shannon organized a private expedition using a small manned submersible called Delta. This was not a robot sending back grainy video. These were human eyes pressed against a thick porthole, close enough to read the ship's name off the hull, close enough to see the individual rivets. Shannon's team made a series of dives, mapping the bow, the stern, the debris field, documenting everything the earlier robots had missed. And on one of those dives, moving slowly along the bottom near the bow section, their lights fell on something the previous surveys had never reported: a body. A human body lying in the silt near the wreck, remarkably intact after nearly 20 years, because Lake Superior at that depth is so cold and so free of oxygen that it does not let the dead decay the way warmer water would. This is why, in the entire history of the disaster, not one of the 29 crew was ever recovered. In most drownings, bodies eventually rise. But in water this cold, that close to freezing, they do not float, they stay. The lake keeps them. There is an old line the locals say about Superior, that she never gives up her dead, and it is not poetry, it is physics. And here is the detail that I have never been able to put down, the detail that is the whole reason I am telling you this story. The body they found was wearing a life jacket. One of the old-style canvas and cork life preservers that the Fitzgerald carried. Think about that for one moment. Think about what it takes to put on a life jacket. Because a life jacket is not something the lake slips onto you. It is not something a wave forces over your head. A man puts on a life jacket with his own hands, deliberately, because in that moment he understands that his ship is dying and the water is coming for him. That life preserver is a decision. It is a man in a pitching, flooding freighter in the dark, reaching for the one thing that might save him, pulling it over his shoulders and tying it on while the deck tilts under his feet. And that shatters the neatest part of the official story, the part that always comforted people, the idea that the end came so fast the crew never knew, that they were gone before they could be afraid. We are holding our own, and then oblivion, painless and instant. That body says otherwise. That body says at least one man aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald had time. Time to understand, time to be afraid. Time to reach for a life jacket and put it on, knowing the water was over 40 degrees below freezing on the wind and 500 feet deep beneath him. knowing there was no lifeboat coming, no rescue in that storm, and to try anyway. When I first read the account of that dive, I sat back from my desk and I could not speak. Because for years I had been chasing a question about engineering, hatch covers or shoals, surface or bottom, numbers and tolerances and stress calculations. And in one photograph, the whole thing became human again. It stopped being about how the ship died and became about how the men did, with their eyes open, reaching. Now I have to tell you what happened after Frederick Shannon's team took those images, because this is the part that turns from tragedy into something colder. Those photographs of the body were published, and the reaction was immediate and furious. The families of the 29 crew were horrified that their fathers and husbands and sons had been photographed lying on the lake bed and shown to the world. Canadian authorities were equally alarmed, because the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald lies just inside Canadian waters, roughly 17 miles from Whitefish Point, at about 47 degrees north and 85 degrees west. And so the government of Ontario did something extraordinary. In 1995, the Ontario Heritage Act was amended specifically to protect this wreck. It became illegal to dive on the Edmund Fitzgerald, to disturb her, and above all, to photograph human remains at the site without a license that would essentially never be granted. In practical terms, the door was slammed shut. What Frederick Shannon's cameras captured in 1994 became something that, by law, no one would ever be permitted to capture again. Now, I understand why that law exists. I do. Those are grieving families, and no one should have to see their father like that in a magazine. I hold both of those truths at once. But I would be lying to you if I said the researcher in me did not feel a door closing on the truth at the exact moment it was finally opening. Because that body, that life jacket, that silt-buried evidence sitting in the dark right now is the single most important physical clue to what really happened in the last minutes of that ship. It tells us there was time. It tells us the men were conscious and aware. And the law, for reasons that are entirely human and entirely understandable, guarantees that clue can never be fully examined again. The following summer, in 1995, a different kind of expedition went down, this one with the blessing of the families. A joint effort involving the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society and the Canadian Navy descended to the wreck for one purpose: not to study the hull, not to photograph the dead. They went down to bring back the ship's bell. On the 4th of July, they cut the bronze bell free from the pilot house and raised it to the surface. And then they did something that I think is the most beautiful act in this entire story. They lowered a replacement bell back down to the wreck, a new one, engraved with the names of all 29 men, so the ship would not be left voiceless. They gave her a new bell so the crew would keep their monument on the lake bed forever. The original bell now hangs in the museum at Whitefish Point, and every year on the 10th of November, on the anniversary, they ring it, 29 times. Once for each man, and then a 30th time for every mariner ever lost on the Great Lakes. I stood in that room once, I heard it, and when the bell rings, you understand that this was never a puzzle. It was a funeral that has been going on for almost 50 years, because the coffin is at the bottom of a lake and no one can close it. So let me bring you back to the question that started all of this, the one I promised I would answer. What really sank the Edmund Fitzgerald? And here is the truth I arrived at. The truth the evidence points to when you stop trusting the tidy report and start listening to the wreck itself. It was almost certainly not the hatch covers. The sailors were right to reject that. The far more likely story is that she was mortally wounded early, probably by grounding on that poorly charted shoal near Caribou Island, taking on water from below through the afternoon exactly as McSorley described. She grew heavier and lower and slower. And then, sometime after 7:10 in the evening, one of those enormous waves, or the pair of them that lake sailors call the Three Sisters, rolled over her bow while she was already low in the water, and she simply drove herself under, nose first. So fast that her bow hit the bottom before her stern left the surface, and 530 feet of falling ship tore itself in half. We are holding our own. And then a wall of water, and the lights going out, and a man reaching in the dark for a life jacket he must have known would not be enough. That is the story the lake has been trying to tell us all along. Not the story in the report, the story in the silt. What I keep coming back to, what I want to leave with you tonight, is not the engineering. It is that one man, whoever he was, and the 2 seconds it took him to decide to fight for his life instead of accepting the end. The official record wanted us to believe none of them ever knew. The lake bed says at least one of them knew everything and chose to reach for the light anyway. That is not a footnote in a marine accident report. That is the last, bravest thing a frightened human being ever did, and it has been sitting 500 feet underwater, protected by a law that means almost no one will ever see it again. If you are the kind of person who cannot accept the neat official answer when the evidence underneath it is screaming something else, then you already know why I could not let this one go. You feel the same pull I felt in that cabin with the rain on the window. So, let me ask you something specific, and I genuinely want your answer. That body in the life jacket, does it change what November 10th means to you? Do you believe the crew was taken by surprise? Or do you believe, like I now do, that they had time to understand? Tell me in the comments. And tell me where in the world you are watching from, because this story reaches people far from that cold gray lake, and I want to know how far. If you found your way here, you belong with the rest of us who keep pulling on the threads that everyone else was told to leave alone, the cases the official reports marked closed while the evidence sat down in the dark, still waiting. There is another wreck I have been chasing, a ship that sent a distress call from a position where, when rescuers arrived, there was no ship, no wreckage, and no explanation at all. That is where I am going next. Stay with me and we will go down there together. Before you go, let me tell you where this goes next. Inside the Unexplained Society, I continue this video with the full dive log and the suppressed photographs, examined frame by frame. You can ask me your own questions and I answer you myself, not some machine. And you won't be alone, you'll belong here with us. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen. Cancel anytime with one click. I'd love to have you with me. Now, if that wreck stunned you, wait until you see what waits at the very bottom of the Great Lakes. Divers reached the deepest point of all, and what they found, is stranger than anyone imagined. It's starting right here.